Welcome to the Middle East Teaching and Learning Conference. I'm delighted to be able to share my presentation with you today. So my presentation is entitled Why Explicit Instruction is the Recovery Curriculum that Schools Need. Now, this is designed in some way to be provocative. This presentation, you have an opportunity at the end to ask me questions, and I will do my very best to respond to all of the questions and comments at the Q&A at the end of this presentation. It is designed to be provocative. I know that not everyone who's watching this will agree with some or all of the things that I say, but I do think that discourse in education needs to be one where people are challenging to the norms, and hopefully through this presentation you'll see that even if you don't agree with what I say, you'll see that there is a level of research and thought that has gone into what I say. So to introduce myself, I'm Ben Rothwell. I'm an assistant head teacher at Victory Heights Primary School. My main focus is on curriculum development and innovation. I have roles regarding assessment as well at the school, and I am the computer science lead teacher, and that's really where my background lies. Around about 13 years ago, I qualified as a teacher. I qualified in secondary education, and I worked in South East England. I've worked in a large secondary modern school, mixed comprehensive. I've worked in a boys' grammar school, and I've worked in a mixed independent school. So I do have a broad range of experiences, and my educational philosophy has changed somewhat since I qualified. I qualified through the graduate teacher program, which is an in-school based program where I learned from a variety of amazing teachers. I never wish to denigrate the teachers that I worked with. They were unbelievable. But since I qualified, the ethos of the school that I worked in and some of the methods that we used and I was taught in, I've changed my perspective somewhat on whether they are the right methods for education in the 21st century. So let's talk about the agenda today. So first of all, we'll address the state of the nation. We'll talk about the fact that we have been in a school closure situation for the last 5 months. Children have been learning at home through distance learning, certainly in the UAE. We don't really know the state of our children's learning. We have an idea, maybe a good idea, but we're not necessarily sure of all of the aspects of what they've learned during this time. We'll talk about what explicit instruction is, get a broader understanding of what that actually means. We'll talk about what it doesn't mean as well. We'll talk then about something called project follow-through, and why that has enormous ramifications on education and this particular model of teaching, and why perhaps you may not have heard of project follow-through. I'll briefly touch upon some of the things that we now know through cognitive science and studies of what the best teachers do about what we know about learning, and why some of those things that we know about learning point to my belief that explicit instruction is the recovery curriculum that we need. I'll try to debunk some myths about what explicit instruction is, and although that's a chapter or a section of this presentation in itself, hopefully throughout the presentation I will be debunking myths as we go. And then briefly at the end I'll share some tips and tricks as to how you could integrate explicit instruction in your own school if you want to go and do that. And then I'll share some further reading that I suggest that will make this journey a lot easier for you. So let's move on to the state of the nation. So at the beginning of March, schools in the UAE closed. Children were sent home do their learning through a distance learning environment. Due to the nature of schools in the UAE, with them being private and parents needing to have support from schools, distance learning programs are very quickly and rapidly rolled out. The school inspectorate here, the Dubai Schools Inspection Bureau, evaluated the performance of schools using a number of different categories and gave them ratings such as emerging and developed. As a result of that, children lost out on some of the experiences that they get through school. They lost out on social contact. They lost out on interaction face to face with the teacher. And although many schools would have conducted Zoom or Google Teams sessions, they never quite replicate the feeling of being inside a classroom. So we talk about children having experienced a trauma, and teachers have experienced a trauma. In fact, all stakeholders in the school have experienced some level of trauma. I know that principals and head teachers found it a very difficult period of time, battling against unknowns, facing budgetary cuts, children and families leaving the UAE due to losing jobs, parents as well then suffering trauma. So undoubtedly there is a trauma element that we need to address. Now, some people, in talking about a recovery curriculum, will talk about focusing on care. In the first 6 weeks or so of term, let's have a recovery curriculum that solely focuses on care. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't address this trauma, that we shouldn't have care at the heart of what we do. But I do feel strongly that we need to make sure that academic success and academic progress is at the core of what we do. I feel that children need to achieve motivation through achieving and learning. For not all children, this will be enough. But for a large majority of our children, just being back in the classroom, achieving, seeing their friends and their teacher, most importantly, learning something new, consolidating old learning, making progress, seeing the benefits of their hard work and the outcomes of their hard work. I feel for a large majority of our children, this will be a sufficient recovery curriculum. I also think that we need to be very careful about time. Children have lost some time now over the course of a 13-year tertiary education. The amount of time that they've lost will bear into some insignificance. I reject the notion that it would damage children's prospects forever. I feel that there is time for the learning that maybe have been lost to be caught up. And we see children in schools across the world where there may have been an event such as an earthquake or a civil war, that once they come out the back end of that, they are able to catch up. And I think perhaps we worry ourselves too much on overthinking what the future might hold and not addressing what we need to do right now. So my manifesto is to make the academic curriculum work as well as it can. Give time to care, give time to the holistic curriculum, make sure that academic curriculum is really on point. The structure, the sequence of lessons is really addressing the children's needs. In school, we do have a holistic approach. We do group work and project-based work. we do some teacher-based instruction, what we will later refer to as explicit instruction. But we just need to tighten that to make sure that when we are delivering academic lessons, we're able to make sure that we're using our time as effectively as possible. So what is explicit instruction? Well, in its simplest and broadest terms, it's teacher-led instruction. The teacher is the arbiter of knowledge. They sequence lessons that allow the children to acquire the knowledge that has been defined, to practice new skills, and to demonstrate their understanding of the knowledge that has been acquired. The teacher is the expert in the room. Explicit instruction can be characterized as being a question-rich environment. It's not a lecture at the front of a room. It is not children working independently and researching to find out information that the teacher wants them to learn. It's a question-rich, dialogic experience where the teacher asks lots of questions, maybe 60 or 70 questions during the course of a lesson. It's engaging due to the fact that all children are involved in thinking and involved in answering questions. And looking at perhaps Doug Lemov's Teach Like a Champion book, where he refers to a technique as cold call, where all children are expected to be able to answer the teacher if called upon. That would be a representation of what may happen in an explicit instruction lesson. It's also known as direct instruction, and I'm going to use lowercase d and I. So direct or explicit instruction can be interchanged for each other. But then there is also large D, large I direct instruction, which is a specific program designed by Siegfried Engelmann, and we'll look at that shortly as to what that is. And when we talk about explicit or direct instruction in the classroom, we're not necessarily referring to the specific program that Engelmann designed, but we can certainly use some of the logic and the rules and the rationales behind the direct instruction program to help us design effective lessons. So let's look a little bit more about direct instruction. Siegfried Engelmann, along with Carl Bereiter at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, set up a preschool in 1964, and they postulated that future learning was really dependent on prior learning, and that the sequence and structure of learning was incredibly important in ensuring that children were able to learn. They believed that any child could learn, but the meticulously planned curriculum was key to that success. This video that I'm about to show on the next slide will show you with 7 4-year-old children from severely disadvantaged backgrounds being taught by Engelmann. Now, prior to the video that you're about to see, Engelmann had addressed some very simple number bonds, such as 8 plus 2 equals 10. The lesson sequence is on, and Engelmann touches upon things such as the perimeter of a rectangle and a square. But he goes back to solving a simultaneous equation with these severely disadvantaged 4-year-olds. And I think it's quite enlightening as to the fact that all children can learn, and we can have really exceptionally high standards of what children can learn. But as education practitioners and designers of curriculum, we need to have and share that ambition that Engelmann did. Some of the key components of what direct instruction is that perhaps only 10 to 15% of the curriculum is new on any one given day. So a teacher will teach 10 to 15% new content, and the rest of the lesson will be practice and review of existing material. ensuring that children build up upon prior learning. This, Engelmann believed, would lead to mastery of the skill. And what Engelmann also did, and perhaps one of the reasons why direct instruction remains not one of the most popular choices, although it's certainly beginning to gain traction again, is that Engelmann believed that explanations needed to be very precise, and so he scripted lessons to ensure that teachers maintained those very precise instructions and didn't create misconceptions or misrules through just giving a bad explanation. So let's now look at that video. Remember, it's 7 4-year-olds from a disadvantaged background in the United States, and we're going to join the video for a couple of minutes as we see Engelmann help these children solve a simultaneous equation.
Getting tougher. Now what does this tell you? This tells you when you add them up together, what happens? Well, look. When you add A plus B, what happens? Well, yeah, but you don't know how big they are. You don't know if they're the same size or not. All you know is that when you add them up, what do you end up with? 14. You add them up, they end up with 14. This tells you how big they are right now. A minus B equals 2. One of them is 2 bigger than the other. 2 bigger than the other. Oh. Well, what if this said like this? What if this said A minus B equals 0? Then what would you know about it? Yeah, say it. You know they'd be 7 and 7. Okay, but they're not 7 and 7. One of them has to be bigger than 7, and one of them has to be smaller than 7. Oh. That's it! 8 plus 6. Very good. Good thinking. This one is 8, and this one is 6. Very good. Cosetta. Okay, now, that's right. This one's an 8. 8 minus 6 equals 2. You guys do a good job. I'd like to thank you very much. Thank you. Have a little chalk. Thank you. A little chalk action there. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Come on. Thank you. Good job. Very good. That's it.
I believe even the most battle-hardened critic of some of the techniques that you may have seen in that video can't help but be amazed by the outcomes of that video. And when we're talking about children's learning, outcomes is the most important thing. How we get there, well, surely we're looking for the most efficient way of getting to the outcomes. Now, in 1968, Project Follow-Through was conducted. It was the largest educational experiment in history. It was conducted by the Lyndon B. Johnson administration in the United States, and in today's money, received approximately $1 billion in funding. It encompassed 325,000 children and 178 individual studies looking at around 22 different programs. These types of programs varied in their scope. We had some programs that were looking at basic skills development, of which direct instruction was one of them. We had some programs that looked at cognitive-conceptual models, and these were instructional designs that were designed to improve things like problem solving and critical thinking. An interesting concept, given so much credence is placed on the 4 C's and 21st century skills. And then the third type of project and learning design was the affective-cognitive models. And these were really looking at improving children's self-esteem. At the time, it was believed that a multitude of these different programs would be needed to help these disadvantaged children that Project Follow Through was addressing. That basic skills models would help improve their basic skills, but they would also need to look at some learning design from cognitive-conceptual models and some from the affective-cognitive models to help improve their self-esteem. But actually, the results were somewhat surprising and somewhat different. So we look at this graph and we can see the center line shows student performance in traditional schools, so what we call sort of our baseline. And we can see these different types. We've got 9 models shown here, different types of attainment in terms of academic skills, problem solving skills and self-esteem. And you can see from this graph that direct instruction, Engelmann's very specific, very structured program, which was, remember, looking at basic skills, led to an improvement in not only the academic skills, but the problem solving skills and the self-esteem. And logically thinking, well, children are achieving. They're being motivated through success. So it stands to reason that the self-esteem would be high. Often we see teachers striving for engagement or motivation by doing fun activities. But ultimately, if that leads to no learning, children can see through that, and that they see that their time is being used merely to keep them entertained. And we've probably all been in professional development where we've been entertained for sure, but we come out of that room with a bit of an empty feeling as we're like, well, did we really learn anything? So this graph really sums up for me why direct instruction and some of the things that we can learn from direct instruction are so powerful. It does improve academic skills. It improves the problem solving skills that we value so highly these days, and self-esteem. And you can see that it outperformed in all of those areas. Now let's look a little bit about what we know about learning. Some cognitive housekeeping, for want of a better expression. So let's talk about the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. The Ebbinghaus forgetting curve suggests that when you first learn something, you have 100% retention, but that quickly drops off. And you can see on this chart that's now on the screen, within 20 minutes, the retention of information has dropped to 58%. We go to 44% after an hour, and 31 days later, we only have 21% retention. Now, in direct instruction, retrieval of prior knowledge is one of the most important things. And every time you retrieve information, you strengthen this forgetting curve. It takes around about 4 retrievals of information to flatten that curve so that you do commit it to long-term memory. Remember, I said 10 to 15% of direct instruction was new material. The rest was retrieval. That's an important thing that we should build into our learning design. Remember, today I'm talking about direct instruction, utilizing some of the features of Engelmann's program, but not necessarily happen to use the fully scripted examples that Engelmann did, but we can learn from some of the positive things that we know about this. Cognitive load theory. In short, it surmises that we have a short-term memory where we can hold 3 or 4 things in memory, and a long-term memory which is virtually unlimited. Our short-term memory is our stumbling block. Because it's so limited in its space, if we have to keep using it, we have to keep interchanging information, that's where we struggle. So for example, we don't know our times tables. More complicated maths that relies on timetables means that we have to juggle in times table calculations, and we overload our working memory. And so that's why it's so important for children to become fluent with number bonds, times tables. Even phonics, the decoding of letters, is something that we rely on. We treat it without, we don't even have to think about decoding, but it's because that is stored in our long-term memory. So it's really important that when we're designing instruction, that we don't overload children's working memory, So we think about what is it that we can do to make things that are fluent, the children are fluent in. And when we're giving information, we're giving too much at one time. And if you study Engelmann's lessons, they're broken down into very small chunks. We also know from Daniel Willingham that memory is the residue of thought. We have to think hard in order to memorize things. So we can have experiences in a classroom where we're having what outwardly appears to be a very fun and engaging lesson. But are we really thinking hard? The children in the video that we watched earlier on were thinking hard. There were times of silence and reflection from those children. And that helps strengthens memory. And this last one, understanding is remember in disguise. Another quote from Daniel Willingham, and I think it's really important. We think that we're understanding things, but actually what we're doing is retrieving things from our long-term memory, things that looked very similar, situations and environments, questions that were very similar. So understanding is more like remembering, and so then problem solving is just remembering what we did before. It's not a skill that can be developed in itself. It's a skill that relies on the development of memory. Some other things that we know about learning, or maybe we don't know. We hear so often these days that knowledge isn't important. We need to develop problem solving skills, critical thinking skills, creativity skills. We can just Google knowledge. But have you ever tried to Google something that you know absolutely nothing about? You don't have the keywords, you don't have any general understanding. And even if you can stumble towards what it is you're trying to find out about, without any understanding of it, perhaps you don't understand some of the words that are used in the definition or the article that you read, you don't really get very far. Just remember that our children are in that situation themselves. They're lacking in vocabulary, they're lacking in knowledge, so they can't just Google it. Also, how long does it take to Google? Sure, it's quicker now that we've got phones and devices, and we can even ask our watch to find information for us. But is it quicker than just remembering something? Don't think so. And the curse of knowledge. Teachers often get caught out by the curse of knowledge. We are experts in so many things. And when you're an expert in things, it's very difficult to understand people not being an expert in things. It's very hard to have empathy for things that look to you to be a very simple problem. And myself, in terms of how I teach people technology, often teachers would say, oh, I don't know how to do this. And it blows my mind that they wouldn't know how to do that. But that's because I'm suffering from the curse of knowledge. I know how to do it. It's almost instantaneous. It's fluent for me. But not everyone does. And this is why sometimes you see lauded professors from places like Oxford and Cambridge who outwardly would appear to be full to the brim with information, absolute experts in their field, but they're unable to transfer it across to the people that they're teaching, because the curse of knowledge means that they can't even understand why people have roadblocks in trying to learn it. And the last thing that we know about learning that is important in instructional design is the Dunning-Kruger effect. Put simply, you don't know what you don't know. And when perhaps you may have been told, ask the children what they want to learn. Well, if they don't know something, if they've never heard, for example, of ancient Rome, will they even suggest it? Of course not, because they don't know what they don't know. As teachers, you're the arbiter of knowledge. You have a curriculum. You have an end goal. You need to make sure that you are the person that plans sequences of lessons. You plan curriculums. You guide children to their destination. We can't just leave it to chance, because people don't know what they don't know. Now let's debunk some myths. So as we've spoken about direct instruction, we've debunked a few along the way. Some people will say that explicit instruction or direct instruction is just teacher talk. It's someone standing at the front of the room just lecturing. But in the example that we saw from Engelmann, it was highly dialogic. The questions being asked of the children, response dealt with the question. So if the response wasn't what the teacher was expecting, the question was changed. More further instruction was given. Engelmann, in the example, changed his example to show A minus B equals 0, and that helped the children get to their end destination. So explicit instruction isn't just teacher talk. In any one lesson, you might expect 60 to 70 questions to be asked. It's not engaging. Well, again, I would argue that in the video that we saw, it was highly engaging. 60 to 70 questions in a lesson where all children are committed to be involved in the learning process, where a question could be asked to the child at any point, where they're almost on tiptoes waiting to give an answer, and the teacher has structured the lesson such a way that all of the children are able to achieve success. And the teacher has determined the exact knowledge that he is going to transfer to that child by the end of the lesson. And all the way through the lesson, checking to see that the child has got the knowledge that he's trying to transfer across, or she is trying to transfer across. Continuously checking, reviewing, getting feedback, acting upon that feedback. For me, that just looks like great teaching. And those children, at the end of that lesson, were able to solve simultaneous equations. Age 4. Blew my mind. And this runs counter, perhaps, to the idea that children learn through discovery. And John Dewey would have said this constructivist notion that children construct their own knowledge. And it runs through recent initial teacher training. A lot of you watching this video would have been told that you're less the sage on the stage and more the guide on the side, and you are there to help children discover their own learning. But things such as the Dunning-Kruger effect and cognitive load show that that is wishful thinking at best, negligent at worst. We look at Hattie, who has shown that discovery learning and project-based learning has a very low effect size, whereas direct instruction has an effect size that's almost unseen, unheard of. Yet discovery learning, sitting back, let the children walk around the room, do research on their own, seems to be the model that a lot of schools take. And it was a model that I would question. You're the teacher, you have very precise understanding of the curriculum, the knowledge that the children need to have. Teach the children that knowledge. See the motivation grow through success, self-esteem grow through success. Talking about a recovery curriculum. Recovery for me is seeing children highly motivated, showing high levels of self-esteem, beginning to have success. And lastly, briefly, let's talk about what explicit instruction looks like in practice. Now, we've seen an example of it. Let's just touch upon, if you're going to go away and think, how can I plan my lessons to incorporate explicit instruction? Well, you need to model with very clear explanations. Engelmann uses scripts. He uses scripts because that way his thinking when he's planning the lesson is on precise instructions. It's easy when explaining something to someone to stumble on your words, to say, well, it's kind of like this. That lack of clarity with explanations, remember we're talking about novice learners, that lack of clarity can really affect children's understanding. They learn misconceptions and misrules. So whilst I'm not asking you to script your lessons, when you're planning the lessons, think about planning learning rather than activities. Plan how you will explain things. If you plan in teams, talk about what is the best way to explain this concept. Practice with your teammates how you would explain it. Are you being as clear as you think you are? When you're delivering a lesson to children, verbalise your thinking. Remember this curse of the expert. Sometimes we're thinking things because we have a certain level of knowledge that perhaps the children won't have. So verbalise what you're thinking. Teach them to think like you think. Provide opportunities for practice. Remember, these lessons, 15% new content. The rest is retrieval, recap, and practice. Explain a small concept and then give the children the opportunity to practice that concept. You might have an idea in your head of how much practice someone needs, but Engelmann says that he thinks that teachers actually need to give 5 times as much opportunity for practice than they may think. So think about condensing what it is that you're trying to teach and giving more time for practice. And lastly, give immediate feedback. Feedback is useless if it is not immediate. The initial learning opportunity has gone. So in schools across the country, children do work, hand their book in, the teacher marks it sometime in the future and hands it back. The children have completely lost where they were in that learning sequence. So give immediate feedback. And one way you can do that is using whiteboards. Very popular tool. They were very popular for a while after Dylan William and his Assessment for Learning book. Then they became a bit out of fashion, but whiteboards allow you to give immediate feedback. Another thing that I really liked is in terms of multiple choice questions. Now we can use technology, we can use things like quizzes and Kahoot, but you don't have to use technology always. One thing that I liked, an example that I saw in another video that I watched, was the teacher telling the children to bow their head, put their hand on top of their head and raise their thumb on a particular answer. So he would call out A, give the answer, call out B, give the answer, C, give the answer. The children bow their heads, they can't see each other's answers, but he's getting immediate feedback. He can see the misconceptions. And remember, when you're designing questions, especially multiple choice questions, build in opportunities where you can see misconceptions. So don't just build nonsensical answers. If you're designing multiple choice questions, you want them to be very realistically close, plausible alternatives. So if you were to say, what is the distance from Earth to the Moon? Saying 5 miles is not a plausible alternative. So that answer, that option A, 5 miles, can be discounted straight away. And so children then have got a narrower guess. So if they don't know the answer, they can have a pretty good guess because they've only got limited amount of options because you've given implausible options. So I hope this video has given you some thinking. I hope you can go away and think about how you can plan explicit instruction lessons. I hope that you perhaps do some further reading. There are some amazing books. You can read some of Engelmann's work, and Shepard Barbash as well has done some critiques and studies of Engelmann's work. There is an excellent book by ResearchHead on explicit instruction. And then there are books on retrieval practice from Kate Jones. There are books on mode A and mode teaching as part of Tom Sherrington's work, the Learning Rainforest. Go away, read, think about the importance of very clear instructions, the importance of knowledge. Think about how the direct instruction model improved not only the basic skills, problem solving, and self-esteem. And my manifesto finishes on, do we want to raise our basic skills? Do we want to raise our problem solving? Do we want to raise our self-esteem? That is a manifesto for a recovery curriculum, and that's why I believe that explicit instruction is the recovery curriculum that we need.